All right, so this week we're going to be talking about the nervous system, the brain, and then some of the neurotransmitters that are going to be the key agents to understanding how drugs impact our behavior and our body. Today's main objectives, and as you can see this week I have it separated into two. So the first one is kind of focusing really on the nervous system and the brain, and then the second, which you can see after this, is basically talking about the neurotransmitters. Now these neurotransmitters are very important to understand in order for us to understand how the various drugs impact our behavior and our body in general. So for today, just the brain and some of the basic functions of each section. Before we get into the brain though, it is important to understand the nervous system. The nervous system is what kind of keeps you going, and drugs impact the entire system. So even when we're talking about certain sections such as our automatic nervous system, or if we're talking about the peripheral, or we're talking about the central, which is just the brain, and the spinal cord, everything is still getting impacted. It's just that they have different roles that are specifically to those systems or those parts of it. It's basically divided into two. So we have the central nervous system, which is basically just our brain and spinal cord. And then we have the peripheral. The peripheral is really everything else. So it's basically the nerve endings that allow you to feel that your feet are cold, or maybe your toe, to move your toe. And it is also the aspects of our controls that are automatic. So for example, why your organs work the way they do without you thinking about them. So your glands are working, your lungs are inflating and deflating. The automatic control system, and then the somatic, which is the voluntary movement. Now the automatic gets even more complicated, and that's really important because, again, if we think about sort of how we live and how we breathe, there's a lot of things that we don't do. So we don't have to think about digesting. We don't have to think about breathing. So that is the automatic controls. And the automatic system is separated into two very important terms that I need you to understand in order for us to understand drugs, which is the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic is basically kind of like your flight or fight response. So that is what arouses you. It's an important system. It's basically what gave survive as a species. And then the parasympathetic is what calms you down. So it's important to be able to get up and go and sort of get out of maybe a dangerous situation, kind of do the fight or flight mode. It's also important to be able to calm down because it's not sustainable to live in that kind of aroused system. That is, again, we're going to talk a lot about drugs, and some of these drugs have effects that people are looking for, like let's say a hallucinogen, like people might want to look for. But besides getting these hallucinations that definitely act on the central nervous system, the brain, we also have those side effects. What you'll see is you might see people potentially sweating a lot, their heart rate goes up, so again the sympathetic gets activated, or maybe they start to really slow down. So for example, we have some depressants out there such as alcohol. Alcohol acts in the parasympathetic system. It kind of calms you down. So there's all kinds of interactions that happen here. So again, the central nervous system, this is both your brain and your spinal cord. Our spinal cord is very, very important. There's almost like a separate activation just as the brain is. For example, our spinal cord is an area of activation that allows us to maybe, let's say you're by the stove and then suddenly touch it and then it's hot, you move your hand and you're like, that hurt. Often you'll move your hand from the stove to avoid the burn before you're even aware. So there's microseconds in there that there's an awareness of this. But often that reaction comes from the central nervous system. So it's kind of automatic, and specifically through the spinal cord. Now, as I mentioned, the sympathetic and parasympathetic, those are branches from the automatic nervous system. And you could also think about these as sort of our gas pedal and our brake. So if our body is sort of like a moving vehicle, the sympathetic would increase it. So that'd be the gas pedal, to move, to get away from danger. And the parasympathetic would be the brake. So that is another part of this automatic nervous system that basically slows everything down. It's very automatic. So there is some control that you can do, such as deep breathing, things to kind of calm you down a little bit, to maybe activate that that parasympathetic and decrease arousal, but these are really automatic things. So for example, if we were all sitting in a classroom and then a random like aggressive looking grizzly bear would come in, we would all just automatically get out of our seats and and our heart rate would increase. Maybe we would start to sweat a little bit. So all these things would happen naturally. So within our bodies, we have two main cells that are what make both the nervous system, both the central and then the peripheral. And those two are the neurons and the glial cells. So we're going to be talking a lot about neurons because neurons are really what receive, integrate, and then they transmit information. So they're kind of like our hardcore little engineers of our body. They do everything. Now the glial cells are basically like support neurons. So they don't necessarily receive information, integrate, but they're definitely like they're needed in order for the system to work. So they keep everything together. They also assist neurons in receiving and transmitting that information faster. So for example, there's a piece of the neuron that's literally made of glial cells and it supports other neurons. So these two components are very important, and it's not that neurons are more important than glial cells. They really are a team. Glial cells have, again, some of the most important jobs, but they're kind of like the basic jobs, such as, again, maybe helping transmit information, cleaning up certain chemicals that don't necessarily belong in our synapse. So there's various important jobs that the glial cells do. They just don't necessarily receive, integrate, or do anything with information in and of itself. So we'll get back to neurons in our next chapter, So the brain, again, it's about approximately 3 pounds. There's 100 billion neurons. That's a lot of neurons. And again, some of these are maybe specifically long. Some of them are are related to certain type of information. So they have slightly different roles in a connect. All right, so going back to the brain, as we're going to cover neurons in our next lecture, the brain can be kind of looked at in different ways. So we're going to look at it in terms of the brain tissue. So there's 3 main kind of zones. We have the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And they have slightly different duties that are associated to the different brain tissue. Now, the other way we can look at the brain is also through the hemispheres. So as most of you know, we have 2 hemispheres. It's basically like we kind of have like a brain that kind of looks like a walnut, where half of it mimics the other half, and it kind of connects in the middle. Now, it's important to know about the hemispheres and how they connect each other because they actually have a really, really awesome relationship with each other. So one thing is that both of these hemispheres are connected to something we call the corpus callosum. And that's like here in the middle, that is kind of like the highway that connects both of the sides. Now, the interesting aspect here, though, is that we have what we call a contralateral control, which means that our left side of our body is basically controlled by the right side of our brain, and our other side of our body is controlled from the opposite side of our brain. Now, this was a really cool finding because one of the things that they found was that you could kind of understand where the stroke is happening depending on the symptoms. So, for example, a person who's having, let's say, immobility in the right part of their face, maybe they're kind of drooping or something, then usually doctors know that the stroke side is going to be on the left side of their brain. And that's, again, very good medical information. Do watch the video that I posted about Jody and the hemisterectomy. So it's a very kind of interesting, controversial, very rare surgery where half of the hemisphere is removed. And as you'll see, we'll see what the effects are for removing half. Now, the reason that I have you watch that show and talk about contralateral control is because it also kind of points out of how placid our brain is. So our brain does manage certain parts. So we have areas of our brain that basically will control our elbow, our wrist, our hand, and again, they're going to do it contralaterally. So what that means is this left side of this brain right here that controls the hand is probably controlling, since it's on the left side, it's controlling the right hand. The cool thing is, though, if a person, our brain is so amazing that it really is made to be adaptive and help us survive. So let's say I had an accident and I lost my hand. We'll say my right hand, since this is the left side. then what the brain usually does is it actually repurposes this area and then just gives you sort of maybe more mobility on the wrist, or it just takes over. It doesn't become like a vacant office. It just becomes a different kind of office, and it just looks at a different kind of mobility. As you'll see in Jodi's story, that's kind of what her brain did. So when they had this removed, then the rest of her body quickly adapted, and they just made room for kind of like controlling that half of her body. So her left side was now being controlled by the one side that was left. So again, going back to how we are dividing the brain, so we have the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. And these are different tissues. That's the difference here. And the different tissues are going to have different aspects, of different parts, like little organs within those cells. So for example, the midbrain is the part that we wouldn't see if we were to just open up a brain. It would be kind of like the middle, so kind of like the seed of. And the hindbrain is this back area. So that's sometimes called the little brain too. We have an entity, this one right here, called the little brain. That is very, very important for some crucial life things such as breathing. And then we have the forebrain, so that is the walnut. All right, so let me tell you the story of the original magic mic before we move on to the importance of the different functions of the parts of the brain. So the original magic mic was actually a rooster. So little chicken down here was a, not chicken, I guess a rooster, was unfortunately had gotten selected by his owner, Lloyd Olson, to become the next soup. And so what Lloyd did was he went outside, he grabbed little Mike and then cut off his head. All right, sorry for the graphic, but that's what happened. And so then he noticed that the little rooster was basically wobbling around and kind of not dying. So he was like, well, I'll just come back later and pick it up for dinner. And he went outside an hour later, it was still there. He went outside a little bit later, and then it was still there. And then what he noticed was that the rooster was actually trying to do chicken things. So it was trying to peck at the ground and grab food. So he was just like, very surprised. Like, what is this headless chicken doing? Why is it still doing natural chicken things, like trying to peck at seeds? What happened here was basically that Lloyd did something that was very rare, which was he basically just cut off the part of his brain that was the forebrain, but he left these two parts back. So he left the hindbrain and the midbrain intact. And in reality, parts of the brain that we really need to survive, they're also what developed and evolved first. So the hindbrain and the midbrain is basically what gives us that kind of reptilian ability to live. So ability to like seek food, ability to breathe, to look, maybe not necessarily think as much, but definitely hindbrain. That is, again, the small brain at the back of our head. You probably have seen some shows or maybe a movie where somebody hits their back of the head and then they pass or they die somehow. And there's actually some truth to that. So that part of our brain is a very crucial and needed area that we need in order for life support. So when we ever have medication that impacts sort of our breathing, or this is an area that impacts. We have the cerebellum right here, the little brain, the medulla, reticular formations inside, so we wouldn't be able to see it if we dissected it, but you would be able to see it if you opened it up, and then the pons. The hindbrain, again, has all these different aspects. We have the reticular formation in the middle that energizes our body. It's affected by sleeping drugs. So a lot of times people think sleeping drugs put you to sleep, but what they do is they kind of block alertness, and then people are able to fall asleep. That's a common. The cerebellum is, again, that little part at the bottom, and that's very important for a lot of our fine-tuned movement. So movement of our eyes, the smoothness, like being able to stand on one leg. It also allows us to learn. So I'm going to skip over a couple of these systems. Now the midbrain, that again is kind of like the seed. That's the middle part. That is a part that if we were just dissect a brain, we wouldn't see it unless we kind of slice it in half. That is the middle. It's definitely the smallest part, but it's very important. So one of the things it does is that it produces dopamine. Dopamine is produced by the substantia nigra, which is also part of that system. Now, as you'll see, though, just because dopamine is produced here and because pain is processed there, there's still other parts of our brain that also process pain and punishment. So the forebrain, the biggest chunk of our brain, that is again the walnut. So that would be this gray area here. So that's a very important area. There's a lot of very important aspects that are connected to that. So for example, our limbic system, which is kind of like our pleasure system. We also have the thalamus, the basal ganglia, and a lot of these basically kind of dictate how we behave. Now the limbic system is our pleasure, but it's also our area that has to do with our survival. So I like to call this the 3 F's in sex, or you could call it, I guess, the 4 F's at that point. It basically is the area that has to do with our eating, so feeding, our fighting, so aggressive behavior, and our phrasing, our temperature regulation control, and then sexual behavior also gets processed in this area. Hippocampus is basically your learning and memory space, and that is easy to remember. Just remember, if you see a hippo in campus, you would probably remember that. So that is our learning and memory area. The amygdala is our fear and aggression. So now 2 more things that I'm going to go over for the forebrain is the thalamus and the basal ganglia. So basal ganglia, important thing for motor control and spatial memory. So for example, remembering if you fit through a certain space would be a spatial memory, or kind of if you have a setup, let's say in your bed, and then at night you're trying to reach over to grab your water, that is spatial memory. Know sort of how far to reach, and then the motor control is also addressed by the basal ganglia. Now the thalamus is a very important role. It's basically our mail person, so it receives information from the outside world, and then it kind of passes it on to the relevant center. Now going back to our largest parts, so this is the cerebral cortex. That's the squiggly lines that we see when we see a brain. This is a very large part. It's also the area that is very placid. So if you have damage in some of your like hindbrain or midbrain, that's not things that can evolve and can adapt to damage. So some of that damage is usually permanent. But cerebral cortex is very placid. So this is why, for example, for Jody, she was able to sort of lead a mostly normal life, where her half of the hemisphere that was still intact was taking over all the movement of her body. And then we usually divide it into 4 lobes. So we have the occipital, the temporal, frontal, and the parietal. And each one of these lobes has a different role. So we have the frontal, that's a lot of our movements and our executive functions. So executive functions would be like you doing algebra. So it's very complex. It's up out here. So it's that also tells us is that was probably the last to develop. Like humans back in the day, where they were just developing, Homo sapiens, they probably didn't need to know algebra to survive, but they did need to know other things. They needed to be able to understand, to get food, what things were dangerous. So this was definitely the area that was the last developed evolutionary. The parietal, that's the information center, and that's our proprioception center. So, and then we have our temporal. That's a very easy one to remember. It's right by the sides of our ears, so it's the auditory processing. It makes sense, again, from a biological standpoint, that it would be there since it's the closest to sound. And if we were to look at our brain from the top, then we would see that we had 2 temporal centers, just like we have 2 ears. And then finally we have our occipital. That's visual processing. And the funny thing is that that's kind of at the very end of our brain. Before we end this part, we definitely need to talk about the neuron, because the next part is talking all about specific types of chemicals, neurotransmitters that influence the neurons. So all neurons are the same. They all have the same type of structure. They might look a little different, but they all have the same type of aspects. So they all have the dendrites, which is basically the receiving information. They all have the axon, which is kind of the highway that spits out the information, and it ends in the receptor sites or the synaptic knobs, which sends out information. And they're all covered by myelin sheath. If you remember what I said about myelin sheath, it's made of the glial cells. And then all neurons look the same. So one neuron is going to transmit information to the next neuron, and they're going to have the same exact properties. Now, the cool thing here is that even though they work in conjunction of a system, they actually never touch. So there's this space in between the synaptic knob right here and the dendrites of the next one that is called the synapse, or the synaptic transmission space. And that is where we're going to hang out a lot when we're talking about different drugs, because that is the space that gets altered by drugs, and that alters how neurons function. Synaptic transmission, again, this is the chemical process. So there's two types of processes here. When a neuron is communicating between each other in that synaptic space, that is a chemical process. So what's actually being transmitted is different neurotransmitters, different chemicals, different drugs. So that is all chemical focused. Now within the actual cell itself, that is an electric process, which is what we call the action potential. And that is depending on stuff within the neuron in there. So a neurotransmitter is basically the chemical. So it's the chemical that influences all the neurons. They are carried in these things we call the vesicles. So a vesicle is basically like a little carrying port that carries all these chemicals within the neuron and then to be released out into the synapse. Here we have two. So let's say this is a synaptic knob right here, and this is obviously a dendrite since it's receiving, and this space in between is the synapse. So the synapse is not an actual structure, it's a space. So if I were to look at these two neurons that I introduced earlier and looked at this little space in between, then this is what I would be looking at. So the presynaptic neuron is basically the neuron that is sending out the neurotransmitters and into the synapse. So it's kind of the message sender, and then the postsynaptic neuron is the one that's receiving it. So if we go back here, this would be the presynaptic neuron, which at one point when it's receiving stuff, it's also the postsynaptic neuron. And this would be the postsynaptic neuron. All right, so I'm going to repeat the process again just because you definitely need to understand what's going on. And if you've only taken psych classes, it might be the first time that you're kind of going through these types of terminologies. So we're going to focus again on the synapse. That's the space between. So we have the presynaptic, postsynaptic cells. And that brings us to this space, which we'll be talking about a lot, and how the different chemicals influence somehow. Like sometimes they'll block the little receptor sites. Sometimes they open the sites that are the channels that open up to the different chemicals. Sometimes they'll mess around with the vesicles. There's a lot of things that go on here. So we've got the terminal button, presynaptic knob, the vesicles carrying all the neurotransmitters, organic kind, and then we have the postsynaptic neuron, and then the synapse. So there's two states of a cell that we need to go over. The first one is the resting potential. So the resting potential is basically where the cell sits at when there's no action happening. So it's resting, just as it says, resting potential. And this typically is negative 70 millivolts. So it happens when there's certain ions in or out, so it just has this kind of good equilibrium between the outside and the inside of the cell. The action potential. And the action potential is when there's actually something happening in the cells and it's firing. So what I want you to know about this is that cells either fire or they don't. There's not really like a partial fire, so there's either going to reach the threshold, which in this case is negative 55, so it has to be kind of like less negative, and then it fires and it throws all the neurotransmitters onto the synaptic knob to be transmitted to the next one. So it either goes or it doesn't. There's not really like a kind of goes. So it's an all or nothing law. So again, we have all these synapses happening, synapse here in this dendrite, synapse over here, synapse here, chemicals coming in, they're exciting it, and then finally it reaches some kind of an ion charging. It gets to negative 55 and it shoots, goes on to the next one, and then it sends out the chemicals to the next neuron. So this axon iliac right here, this would kind of be like our trigger. So for a gun usually shoots or it doesn't. I guess there's some mishaps that can happen. Maybe it's not the best kind of example, but if we kind of think of a fully working gun, it either fires or it doesn't, right? So the axon iliac is kind of like the trigger. So once it gets to this negative 55, it fires, and there's like no stopping it. So here is a good illustration of what this looks like and how it's sort of like a chain reaction, and it moves to the next one. See here, it's getting polarized, so there's like positive charges coming in, and then it gets to the point where it's negative 55 and it's less negative, and then it shoots, less negative and it shoots, and it's a chain reaction, because then once you get some of these chemicals into the process, into the synapse. Here's the vesicles that we talked about that carry all the neurotransmitters. There's enough of those coming in, and then suddenly there it goes. Okay, so that's just a very simple illustration of how that works, is that we have a couple of terms that are going to come up a lot, and that's agonist and antagonist. So an agonist is a substance that binds to a receptor and it mimics it, so basically makes it go. So there's some chemicals out there, for example, that and will make the cell activate. And then there's antagonists. Antagonists reduce the effect. So agonists increase it, antagonists decrease it. So there's also some combo medications out there that sort of serve as both, but that gets a little bit more complicated. So that is it for today. Do look at the next part of this lecture, which is all focused on neurotransmitters.